I was just saying that I'm very happy to be here. We have a lot to discuss: bilateral relations, trade and commercial topics, as well as a number of international subjects. We have many challenges, such as Iran, the situation in Syria, regional security. We share a common goal, which is to avoid an escalation and avoid nuclear proliferation in the region. The question is, what is the best path?
It just seems that no matter where you go, especially in the Middle East, Iran is behind it. Wherever there's trouble, Yemen, Syria, no matter where you have it, Iran is behind it. And now, unfortunately, Russia is getting more and more involved. But Iran seems to be behind everything where there's a problem.
Elena Casas takes a closer look at the French companies that may be affected if the US hits Iran with more sanctions.
As world leaders celebrated the 2015 agreement to lift nuclear-related sanctions on Iran, some of France's biggest companies spotted an opportunity. Oil giant Total struck a deal to sink $5 billion into Iran's offshore gas fields over the next 20 years, while automaker Renault, hoping to tap a potential market of millions of middle-class Iranians, opened a factory last year that should produce 150,000 cars in 2019. But few smaller companies have followed suit, largely because no big lenders will facilitate the transfer of money to Iran.
Major European banks, because of the ongoing US sanctions which are not connected to the nuclear deal, and the sanctions imposed in the past, when they consider what they could gain in the Iranian market against the risk, they decide the risk is higher.
Some of France's biggest companies have already felt the sharp edge of US sanctions. Back in 2014, BNP Paribas was fined a record $9 billion for breaking the restrictions in place at the time, restrictions that could soon be reimposed. If US President Donald Trump decides not to re-sign the waiver on those sanctions by May the 12th, European companies dealing with Iran would immediately be exposed to penalties in the US.
That is why for the Iranians, if the US is out, then the deal altogether collapses. Even if Europeans or other countries wish to stay in the deal, in fact, the indirect sanction of the US law would make it impossible for a French company to invest in Iran.
Total, for one, insists it's committed to Iran and would seek a waiver from the US government if the deal is abandoned. But the oil giant, like other French multinationals, will be hoping their president really does have the ear of Donald Trump. Elena Casas, TRT World, Paris.
So let's go to Paris now, and our editor-at-large, Craig Copetas, joins us from there. Craig, great to have you, as always. Tell us a little bit more about how badly French companies might be affected if US sanctions get reimposed.
Well, the French opened an economic office in Tehran in 2015, and they have a goal to increase the level of investment there to 1.4 billion euros, which was the high that it was back in 2002. And they're looking at this investment, mostly small and medium-sized companies, because the big mega projects outside of the oil sector that France used to be so good at are being undercut for cheaper prices and done by Russia and China. So it's a real big deal, for them. But the biggest deal here, which Macron and Trump have not addressed, if they reissue the sanctions on May the 12th, who's going to be excluded from the extraterritorial application of U.S. law, going against French interests, EU interests, and everyone else's interests? Is the United States government going to take the French oil firm Total to court in the United States, perhaps jail them and fine them, in excess of the $9 billion they fined BNP Paribas for doing business with Tehran?
Yeah, so that bromance may not necessarily last all that much longer. Look, Trump has also been talking about trade with France. Before we go on, let's have a quick listen to what Trump said.
The president and I working on trade. The trade with France is complicated because we have the European Union I would rather deal just with France. The Union is very tough for us. They have trade barriers that are unacceptable. Our farmers can't send their product into the European Union easily as they should, and we accept their product, so we have to make a change.
So, Craig, is Trump, do you think, trying to drive a wedge between France and the rest of the EU?
Yeah, well, you know, Macron and Trump share one thing, and they share one thing in common, which is they both annoy Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. And right now, Macron needs Donald Trump, and he needs American investment because he's faced with high unemployment, the second highest tax burden in the OECD world, an outdated industrial base. He's got these unions going after him, and he has this 10-year plan to transform France and the EU. And the reason France is in this mess is because France has been unilateralist for decades upon decades. The French called it mercantilism. And I think what you're seeing here in Washington is that it takes a unilateralist to convince another unilateralist that unilateralism doesn't really work out in the 21st century with free global trade.
Yeah. Look, let's talk about the relationship between these two men for a second. We keep hearing it being described as a bromance. Macron is being treated really well in Washington, but we also know that Trump can flip very easily. How is this trip likely to end, do you think?
Oh, I think it's going to end on a very high note. I wouldn't call it a bromance at all. Trump enjoys Macron's intellectualism. Macron is an intellectual. He has a solid grasp of history and the all-important details of history, and he knows how to leverage the nuances of history, such as the tree from Bella Wood, which was planted on the White House grounds, referring to, as he did in his comments today, about the key to the Bastille, which was given to George Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette. You know, the reason this is going to work, and this has to do with the whole disruption of French culture, because that's what Macron is trying to do. He's disrupting here. And it comes down to this, when you talk to businessmen, when you talk to people here, and you boil it out all down as, France for centuries has measured failure. Americans measure success. And what Macron is trying to be, if there's an undergirding to what he's trying to do to the French economy, he's trying to get the French to start measuring success and not failure. And it's going to be a long process, at least 10 years, according to Macron.
Look, Craig, as we've said, the focus is, at least for the moment, on keeping that Iran nuclear deal alive. Some think that Macron did Trump a favour by backing a coalition to strike Syria a few weeks ago. Might that make Trump more sympathetic towards Macron, do you think?
I think he's giving Macron a hearing. I think he's listening to him. I think he's impressed by his intelligence and savoir-faire. Macron represents what Trump would like to be, but isn't. Macron is playing that very well. You know, what's going on here is Macron is trying to show Trump sectorization. Trump wants to link everything together. Trade with Iran, the nuclear issue, the war in Syria, what's going on in Yemen. So Macron is trying to split it apart for the President of the United States, and again, make sure that those French deals with Iran keep going.
Craig Copetas in Paris, thank you so much.